Here's a peculiar fact. If everything goes the way we expect it to, a lot of what your science faculty teach you will end up being false. What Althusser is telling us in his theory of ideology is that if everything goes the way those in control of our society expect it to, everything that I teach you is going to end up being false. He doesn't mean the trivial mistakes I make or the outright lies that I tell you. He means the core of the message that I teach you should end up being false. The core of my teaching will not be the truth. And that's not because that I am lying to you. It will be this other creature called ideology. That's what I'm going to try to explain in this video through Althusser's essay, Ideological State Apparatuses. Think of what I'm doing as giving you the distilled nectar of his theory, or if you prefer, as the pre-digested version of his theory that I am vomiting into your waiting baby bird mouths, whichever metaphor you prefer. I will not judge your choice of metaphors. You may want to take some notes. You may want your copy of the essay as I formatted it for our class in beautiful Baskerville font. You may want to be in a quiet place free of distraction. You may want a comfort animal. I'll be citing the page numbers from the version that we have. As I see it, Althusser's theory of ideology can really be reconstructed through 3 points. First, what he calls thesis 1, which is a simple declarative sentence that contains in it a definition of ideology, a complete definition. Second, the statement, ideology has a material existence, which is on our page 20. That's thesis 2. And then third, again quoting him, the statement, ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. First, I should say that I wouldn't be doing this at all if it weren't for the fact that I can't seem to find a free quasi-legal way of getting a link to you for a film by a guy named Slavoj Žižek called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology that presents a theory of ideology that he never really names the primary theorist for, but it seems close enough to Althusser's theory, and he presents it through film in a way that's pretty accessible and pretty entertaining once you figure out how to listen to Žižek and his speaking style. I think he's a blast. If you can get your hands on this in a streaming version in some fashion or other, I recommend it. It's pretty good. And it may help also explain ideology to you in a way that is helpful. I don't have the benefit of film to show you, but I hope that I will give you a couple examples that will be helpful. Let's jump in. So the first section of this is about thesis 1, which is this simple declarative sentence. Notice that's a comment on the grammar of it and nothing else. The sentence is, this is on page 19 of our text, ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. What follows in his text is a series of remarks about the history of the concept of ideology from its beginning in French thought, and I think also German thought, through Feuerbach and Marx. Ludwig Feuerbach was a so-called young Hegelian philosopher who was a big influence on Marx's early development and who's pretty interesting in his own right. And I'm only going to draw a little bit from Althusser's walk through that to get at what he gets from Marx before going into his own interpretation of ideology. remember what we've talked about ideology so far. What ideology is, so far as we know so far, my sort of off-the-cuff definition is it's an interpretation of reality that's intended to be taken as reality and not an interpretation. So people in a dominant position in society use ideology in order to try to convince people that this interpretation just is what is real. The question that is on Althusser's mind predominantly is, how does it work? So, going back into the 18th century, the answer was priests and despots did it. And they did it with what Althusser calls the forging of beautiful lies. This is a simplistic idea of how ideology works. It's essentially tricking people, lying to them. They enslaved people's minds by dominating their imaginations with stories about a man in the sky, or the power of the king, or some other such thing that would scare them into compliance and get them to be obedient and thus control them. It's a very simplistic idea of how ideology works. It suggests that people are just fearful and that they will buy a kind of scary story or any story about an invisible power. The second explanation, which is Feuerbach's, that the early Marx, he alludes to the 1844 manuscripts of Marx, which deal with the alienation of labor, a period of Marx's work that's very immersed in the thought of Hegel. This is more profound, Althusser says, and then he says that means it's just as false. This is one of the things I love about Althusser, is that he is so snotty, and this is one of his snottier lines in this essay. I like it. So this explanation of ideology is that it's not a despot or a priest that's coming up with ideology. People come up with it on their own, and they come up with it on their own through their own alienation. This leads in Marx to the idea of false consciousness. People create their own false consciousness because of the alienation of their labor. Factory labor alienates us, Marx explained, from everything that makes us human, ultimately, including our connection to other people. And as a result, we develop explanations in our minds about what's going on, and these are ideological. We come up with ideas that are not real ideas. We see the world from the standpoint that we have in our little worlds. Well, in both cases, Althusser says, the assumption made about ideology is that ideology is a reflection on the real world. That what we are distorting is a direct relation to the real world. The despots lie to us by telling us that the king has these powers, is more than human, is divinely named, is actually somehow divine himself. Or the priest tells us that the divine order puts us in our particular place on earth. And that's supposed to explain what's going on here on earth. So the ideology is supposed to reflect directly in that way on what's happening in our world and the real conditions of our world. In the second explanation, Feuerbach's and early Marx's, it's our own consciousness reflecting directly on what's going on in our own everyday lives that immediately reflects on the working conditions that we're dealing with. the everyday lives that we're dealing with. And so its story, our own story, is about our own lives and immediately deals with the facts of our own lives, but does so in a way that reflects them incorrectly, reflects them falsely. Well, neither of those is what's really going on, according to Althusser. It's more complex than that. So, here are a couple of examples of the way in which that view of ideology is, in Althusser's view, incorrect. So, here's what that more simplistic view of ideology would have us believe is going on in ideology. For instance, the ideology says, this is sort of the ideology of the United States, you are free to make whatever choices you want about your life. The reality is that your choices are determined very much by wealth and by income. And the game of wealth and income is rigged by those who already have a huge accumulation of wealth and a huge income. The result of this gem of ideology is that you'll play the game according to these rigged rules, and you'll lose. Meanwhile, the people who already have this wealth will continue to gain wealth by playing the same rigged game that you're playing. So they'll just keep collecting more winnings. Another ideological gem that we have is any native-born citizen of the US can grow up to become president. The reality is, no one who has expressed a non-Christian faith has become president. No woman has become president. The result of the ideological claim is to get you to believe in the legitimacy of electoral politics, so you don't question the entire system. The system of law, government, party politics, so that you don't go looking for alternatives or raise uncomfortable questions and so on. But all that is so obvious. It doesn't take Althusser or Marx. It doesn't take you becoming a communist to understand that the economic system is rigged against anybody but the wealthy. You don't have to be a political radical to see that the electoral political system is rigged against anybody but people that look like and talk like and act like people who currently have power becoming part of the electoral political system. All of it is too obvious to be true, or at least to be the whole truth in Althusser's sense of the way the world works. This is something else I like about Althusser. Remember, at the very beginning of the essay, he tells us that this is sort of a tenet of belief for him. Something that's obvious can't be entirely true. He doesn't say it this way, but maybe it's because ideology can't be a lie in an obvious sense. It's not just an illusion or a deception in an obvious sense, because the masses just aren't that stupid. Which is nice. He's saying, in essence, that ideology can't be that simple because we're not that dumb. So let's set that aside now, why the idea of ideology can't be that simplistic idea, and go back to thesis one. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. All right. Time to get serious. I'm going to omit the part about dream interpretation. It's fun. Might get us a little off the course. But it is how he gets there, because there were interpretations of dreams that were current when Marx was writing, and he uses that to get at how Marx starts using the word ideology instead of false consciousness later on in Marx's career. So if you imagine ideology working like an inverting mirror, that everything in the mirror is turned upside down, that's the simplistic idea. Just inverts everything so that everything that was one way is turned upside down. That's the simplistic idea. It's more like a funhouse mirror. And here's why. I'm going to break down this sentence, see if this helps you. And then I'm going to give you this concrete example that I think will be possibly easier to understand the whole concept. So, okay. Ideology represents. Okay, it represents. That means it reflects it. From the dream part that I am not going to go into, he plays on the word illusion and allusion. Allusion is a reference, right? Illusion means something that isn't real. Something can be an illusion and an allusion at the same time. It reflects in an elusive and allusive way. So it represents in a way that is on this hesitating boundary between real and unreal. But definitely the important part here is that it's making a reference to, it represents in a symbolic way. It's not a direct picture of, it's not a direct depiction of the reality of, but it represents it. And what it represents isn't the real, it represents something imaginary. That's the second word, the imaginary, not the real. But what we imagine to be our relationship. So, relationship. Our relationship, not our immersion, but how we respond to, how we set ourselves over against, how we enter and retreat from as individuals. The real conditions of our existence. All right, so I'm going to start from the bottom and move up again. The real conditions of our existence. That's not where we live. Not in terms of our consciousness. We wouldn't be able to bear it. I'm not going to push this point right now. I will talk about it in a minute through my example. It's going to get gross. We just couldn't face it, moment to moment, day by day. The real conditions of existence would overwhelm us. I don't know that he's drawing from the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, but he might be. The real conditions of our existence as individuals, we have a relationship to those. We deal with them. We ignore them. We hate them. We avoid them. Feel anxiety towards them. Fear them. Right now, it's a great example. The real conditions of our existence are, most of us are sheltered in place. What that means about each individual's existence, well, it varies from person to person. But we don't live consciously in the real condition of that existence. We live, really, in our relationship to it. Many people have anxiety about it for various personal reasons that don't matter, my anxiety about it is pretty low. That's my relationship to it. Now, the imaginary is what I tell myself. For instance, what I just told you. I don't have much anxiety about COVID-19. Well, I imagine I don't have much anxiety about COVID-19. That is, I tell myself that I imagine that I don't have much anxiety about COVID-19. And voila, we have a picture of ideology. That was pretty quick. The real condition of my existence is I'm sitting here at the table in the war room, which is what I call my study. And I'm reading notes and saying words about ideology. And I'm drinking coffee. My actual social and economic life consists of this right now. And Zoom meetings, which I'm terribly sick of. That's my relationship to my Zoom meetings right now. I'm dependent upon them, and I am sick of them. My imaginary relationship to my Zoom meetings is that I'm dependent on them, and I'm sick of them. I represent them to myself in those ways. Voila. So the concrete example that I have in mind, imagine a conversation. Pardon me, I'm getting my piece of paper. I still use pieces of paper. Conversation at like a cocktail party or something where I am there with people that don't know me from, I'm not going to say Adam. And someone says, so, what do you do for a living? I might say, being a relatively normal person, I teach philosophy for a living. That statement, I teach philosophy for a living, is something that we can break down as a way of explaining what Althusser is saying by his definition of ideology in Thesis 1. I teach philosophy for a living. So, here is the breakdown. I have posted this little guy on Blackboard. This is the ideological statement. I teach philosophy. I'm representing to myself the imaginary relationship of myself to the real conditions of my existence. I imagine that I teach philosophy for a living. What I said is that I teach. That's a representation. It's an interpretation. It's a symbolization of an imaginary relationship. The imaginary relationship, the imagined thing, is teaching. Teaching is something that I'm just imagining. I can prove it, and I will. Why is teaching just something that I'm imagining? Well, why do I mean that I'm only imagining it? What I'm imagining are the effects of what I do. But in fact, I have no proof that anything that I do ever results in this thing called teaching. I imagine that I have students. I imagine that they learn. I imagine that it matters. Just as right now I'm imagining someone will watch this video. But all of that is just part of this imaginary relationship that I have to the real condition of my existence. Without that, nothing that I'm doing would make any sense to me. And I sure as hell wouldn't be able to represent what I'm doing by saying, I teach philosophy for a living. Imagine how embarrassing it would be if I were to tell somebody what I actually do. And what I actually do, the real conditions of my economic existence in terms of what I do for a living, what I really do, is I read and I write and I talk. That's what I really do for a living. I read and I write and I talk. Now, I read and I write and I talk, interpreting things that I read as messages, preparing things that I write and say as messages. I'm sending messages, I'm interpreting messages. But in doing so, I'm already entering an imaginary relationship with imagined individuals whose response to my messages I am imagining. So I've prepared this interpretation of Althusser's theory of ideology, imagining an audience of my students. And I'm imagining teaching as the result of this. I can never know whether it happens. I have no idea. Do my students read the things that I ask them to read? I can't prove it. Do my students learn things from my courses? I couldn't demonstrate that. So, do I teach philosophy for a living? Where does the teaching happen? I can't see it. That's ideology. The question now is, how can this ideology become a power for social control? How does it exist? And why is he telling us this?